What is a secret your parents hid from you that turned out to be very important? My brother was shot and Una lived in Koreatown as a result of gang violence. Didn't find out until 2 years later. That my doctor diagnosed me with an ibuprofen allergy as a baby. Learned it for myself after a fun ER visit in my early 20s. The fact that my grandfather had a heart attack that almost Una-lived him. This was only admitted by my grandmother when my dad had a heart attack that almost Una-lived him. Later my uncle had a heart attack that actually Una-lived him. And my aunt began suffering from heart issues as well. There's a good chance heart disease runs in our family, so knowing this is definitely very important. My grandfather had prostate cancer. Family never talked about it. Then I got prostate cancer, and they were like, hey, what are the odds? Never met my dad. Turns out he was a schizophrenic drug addict. Guess who's schizophrenic now? My parents didn't tell me about my cerebral palsy diagnosis until I was 13, even though I was diagnosed around 18 months. I'm really mildly affected obviously, but it's become far more important as an adult as I have health issues, need to exercise in an adapted environment, have a slight learning disability that makes aspects of college hard, and can't drive due to my condition. When I told my mom that I had horrible depression and I needed treatment or I would fail out of college, she said, well, I'm not surprised. We're all taking antidepressants. MOM. This would have been useful information to have before college. One of my parents casually mentioned a mental health condition that the other had been diagnosed with before I was born. That nobody had mentioned to me ever in my life even though I was pushing 30. Finding that out made some things click. My mother told me casually last year that years ago when she was married to her second husband, that was when I was 12, she called the police on him once because he threatened her and refused to let her leave and the SWAT team surrounded the house demanding to release her. I was so shocked about this information and wanted to more, but she was like, meh, it's not that important, and she ended the conversation. I guess it's important to me to see the stuff my mom put up with him before she left him. Just found out yesterday that my family is more susceptible to getting blood clots in your legs, which can then travel to your lungs. My grandma had a problem with it, my uncle died from it, and I only found out because my dad died yesterday from it. My aunt just happened to mention that they all take baby aspirin to prevent it. Fudge, I wish I would have known that sooner. That my mom became, effectively permanently, mentally ill from her pregnancy with me, bipolar disorder plus paranoia, possibly paranoid schizophrenia. My mom raised me in a pretty aggressive Christian household. When we finally got TV, I discovered HBO had like a 5-minute preview of movies/shows whatever. Then I saw the late night shite. Well, our TV was locked down with a passcode. I had to be like 11 or 12, but I put a VHS and then hit record. I then told my mom that I wanted to watch an animal documentary, but it was locked TV 14 for the animal violence. Well, she had me turn around while she scrolled the password in. After she left for work, I rewinded the VHS and got the password. Sorry, Mom. When I was a junior in high school, my mom and I got into a low-speed accident with minor damage to both vehicles. Later that month I was so exhausted from school that I decided to ditch. I drove on the back roads for 10 minutes and parked, and then slept. My mom found out and was furious at me. I lied and said that it was because I wasn't feeling good and I had headaches and some BS like that. She took me to the doctor and they found that my C3 vertebrae was fractured on top of having a tumor growing on it. I ended up having a gnarly 10-hour spinal surgery that honestly completely changed the course of my life. And we only found out about it because I couldn't think of any other bullshit excuse to use. I had a brother that only lived 12 hours. He was 2 years younger than me, so I didn't remember until they told me when I was 10. Years later, I found out his birthday was the same day as my next-door neighbor's. My parents had chosen to hide their painful remembrance and emotions so that I was able to enjoy 6 or 7 birthday parties in the neighborhood before we moved. My autism diagnosis wasn't told until after I was having my own children assessed. My mom is also autistic, that was obvious, but she always denied, breast cancer being something that runs in the family, and that my great-uncle was a convicted pedophile. I was only told when my own son was 2, because his targets were young boys, so I didn't need to know before then. I no longer have any contact with that side of the family. I was diagnosed with autism at 5 and wasn't told until I was 25. Would have saved me a lot of therapy trips if I'd have known that sooner. My uncle, grandfather, and grandmother were alcoholics on my dad's side. 2 died from it. They told me after years of drinking took me to my first 30-day inpatient rehab. They told me on visitation day. I can't say knowing any sooner would have given me a different outcome, but a heads up would have been appreciated. 7 years sober now, get help if you or anyone you know has an addiction. Edit, I have one 2.5 years old daughter and she'll be told when she gets older. Dang, these are deep. I was just gonna say that Santa wasn't real. That I had an older half-sister who was given up for adoption. My mum had to tell me because she turned up on the doorstep one day. At the age of 12, we'd been the typical mom, dad, and 2 kids family. By the time I was 15, my parents had divorced and remarried, and I now had a sister, 2 half-sisters, 2 half-brothers, and a step-sister. My mother hid the identity of my father from me for 35 years. I don't look like her. I don't act like her. I look like a taller, less olive version of him. My personality is like a carbon copy of him. He died 3 years before I knew who he was. I don't know what I would have done with the information if he were still alive, but I still feel extremely slighted because half of my identity was withheld. I haven't really talked to anyone about this. I still have no way of confirming this, but I have a very strong reason to believe that my mom had cancer, and neither she or my dad told me or my siblings. I have an uncle who's slightly older than me. Growing up, my grandpa always treated like crap. Soon after my grandpa died, me and my dad are driving and he stopped in a little shopping center, asks if I knew why my grandpa was so hard on my uncle, and when I said no, my dad pointed to a man who looked exactly like my uncle standing outside a 7-Eleven and said, "That's his real dad." My grandpa always suspected but never knew. Now everyone knows but my uncle. How little my dad wanted me. I was adopted at birth, largely BC. My mom wanted at least 1 kid, and to quote my dad, he didn't really want kids, but my mom did, so we compromised and got you. At the time, it was a cute, funny story, but the older I get, the worse the feeling gets. One of my best friend's father hit on my mother all the time while we were at school. She finally told my father. It didn't end well for my friend's father. My friend wasn't allowed to come over anymore, and he wouldn't talk to me anymore at school. At that age, I didn't know what happened and wouldn't understand anyways. I thought he hated me for some reason. I cried over it. I missed my friend. I've no proof, but I suspect my 2 oldest siblings are not actually my mum and dad's kids. They emigrated to the UK decades ago when checks were more lax and Britain needed more labor resources. They brought 2 kids with them, then had 4 more in UK. The 4 younger ones all look like each other, have very similar traits and resemble mum's features a lot. The older 2 look nothing like the younger 4 at all, or like my parents. A major reason that my mom and dad separated was that my dad was a serial cheater. I didn't find out until I was 19. Found out my grandmother had a brother she never told anyone about after she died. There are cousins on that side too. There's a lovely family history of alienation, favoritism, and secrets. Evidently it's multi-generational. Found out during COVID that the man who raised me is not my father. My mother Una lived herself over 20 years ago. Found this out from 23andMe after matching with a half-sibling. She told no one. Some family members don't even believe me. Big surprise, I look just like my dad. He unfortunately passed in 2017, so I never got to meet him. The thing that makes me the angriest about the whole situation is her not even coming clean after my daughter's cancer diagnosis. At 22 months she was diagnosed with retinoblastoma. Had her left eye removed. We went to genetic counseling after this because it could be a hereditary cancer, which would mean it would happen in the other eye. For 2 months I waited to find out if it had spread to her brain. This woman acted like this was the most difficult time in her life, but still couldn't be honest with me. I had no idea this was even a possibility until the week before she lived herself. That's when she said, "He's not really your dad." Refused to explain herself. Refused to tell me who my dad was. Then shot herself in the head, leaving me to clean up her life mess. I could have had 13 years with him had she told me then. My uncle lived himself when I was 3, and my dad had had issues with substance abuse when he was younger. Years later I would develop addiction and make an attempt on my own life. I'm not sure if knowing would have helped, and I can understand why my parents didn't tell me, but I wonder. I inherited a college fund, but didn't know, and my dad spent it on booze and drugs. Life could have been so different. I was diagnosed with ADHD at the age of 8, and they completely hid it from me because my mother was in denial and my dad didn't want me taking pharmaceutical meth. This was back in the 90s, where if you were anything but conforming normal, people around you weren't so accepting. I thought I had bipolar disorder because of how my mood swings are. Turns out I could have avoided nearly 2 decades of hell if my parents just told me the truth. Even if I didn't seek treatment for it, knowing what was wrong would have made such a huge difference when I was a kid. Hell, just a simple dose of caffeine is all it takes for me to be functional. To know it was that simple enrages me, and I still have yet to forgive my parents for it. They knew, and they let me suffer for their own vanity and fantasy world where everything is fine and normal. Life is fine now, but I went through so much unnecessary hell for more than half of it.